Well, we're joined from central London by the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Well, Sir Malcolm, are we looking, as some have said, at the prospect of a second Cold War here?
Yes, we probably are, but not in the sense that existed in the 1970s and 1980s. This is not a question of a Cold War that could lead to a hot war, at that time involving nuclear weapons. We're not remotely in that sort of territory. But what we are seeing is a defining moment for the relationships between Europe, the West as a whole, and Russia. Diplomacy, obviously, is what's being used at the moment to try to discourage Mr. Putin. But we need to come to a pretty clear idea in the next 24 hours as to what his intentions are. If he wants this to be de-escalated, he has to give a very clear signal of two things: that he recognizes and accepts the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that the Russian troops are going to be withdrawn to Sebastopol very quickly. If he doesn't do that, then you are going to see a very rapid deterioration of the substance of relationships between Russia and not just the West. I should imagine China will be as angry as the rest of the world. China is Russia's other neighbor, and that also has to be borne in mind.
Okay, but clearly a very serious situation then. But in the seriousness of that situation, the West, the power of the West is slightly hampered, not least because the British Parliament voted against military action in Syria, and that's contributed to this sense, has it not, of the West being somewhat powerless, and Putin is exploiting that.
Yeah, well, on the margins perhaps, but I don't think that is that significant. We all know that Russia, since the end of the Cold War, has had ambitions to try to recreate some kind of control over what used to be parts of the Soviet Union. Putin once said that the greatest geopolitical disaster in his lifetime wasn't the collapse of communism, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, by which he meant the Russian Empire. And Ukraine, the reabsorption of Ukraine into some sort of control by Moscow has been his ambition. That collapsed when Yanukovych fled to Russia. We're now seeing the consequences of that. I just make one additional point at this stage, and that is we keep being told that Crimea is occupied by the Russian public. It's a Russian majority territory. It is a Russian majority territory, but almost 40% of the people in Crimea aren't Russians. They're Ukrainians or Crimean Tatars or other countries. So Crimea is as ethnically divided as parts of Ukraine itself are. The Russians have no claim to that territory or to any undue influence on it.
Okay, so how then can the West demonstrate that it does have power over this situation to exercise?
Well, you're going to see not just one thing in isolation. Several things are developing. The Ukrainian government have mobilized its armed forces. So far, they've shown extraordinary restraint. How long that can last is difficult to know. But if that turns into a shooting match, we saw with Finland and the Soviet Union in 1940, with Georgia and Russia, although the Russians might eventually win, it would take quite some considerable time. They would suffer a lot of losses. You would have a serious military conflict. Putin, if he's in his right mind, cannot be wanting that to develop. If that is combined with the prospect of Russia losing its relationship with the European Union, losing its relationship with NATO, seeing an abandonment of the G8 summit that was due to take place in Russia, not to mention a whole range of other economic and other measures that the United States, the West, can take, with, I suspect, the support of most of the international community, Putin would be making a huge political and diplomatic disaster for himself, quite apart from the military implications involved in going to war with Ukraine.
Okay, so Malcolm, we'll be back with you in a moment to unpick some of those points with some other guests, but thank you for now. Thank you very much. Yep. Well, Lindsay, the Russian media are reporting that there's evidence of a humanitarian catastrophe in Crimea. Have you seen any evidence of that?
Well, there might be humanitarian problems in that base, which we were reporting from earlier. I've just heard from a former soldier who spoke to a colleague in there that the Russians have now cut off the water and electricity. And it's possible that that will be the tactic that they use for trying to get those Ukrainian soldiers out of those bases. But in the wider Crimea, no. I mean, the Russian media was reporting this morning that 675,000 Ukrainians and Crimeans have fled the country since January. There are no refugees on the road. There are no hungry people here. There is no evidence of that kind of crisis. But the justification that President Putin is giving for this intervention is humanitarian. He says that Russian citizens need help. That's exactly the reason that was given for his intervening in Georgia in 2008, and that ended up in a shooting war. That's why people are so worried.
Lindsay in Simferopol, thank you very much for joining me. Well, we're joined again by the former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkind, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Anne Applebaum, ex-Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov, and James Jeffrey, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor under President Bush. Well, James Jeffrey first, then. It is the case, is it not, that a divided West that was paralysed over Syria has now empowered Putin, has it not?
It may have, but remember, this was self-paralyzation. The West acted decisively in Libya just a year before, and it could act again if it so wanted.
Well, how should it act, in your view?
Well, first of all, you have to separate it. Right now, just as with Georgia in 2008, hours and days matter. We need to talk urgently to the Russians again. We probably should have the president calling Turchinov, not simply Secretary Kerry, possibly putting people, that is diplomatic liaison on the ground with the Ukrainians to show them that we consider them a UN member state and we consider this aggression. But at the moment, we have to be very careful because we don't want to provoke Putin. In the larger sense, exactly what Sir Malcolm said is on target. We need to reconsider how we've been looking at the world since 1990 if Putin's going to continue these things.
Well, and having advised President Bush over the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, as we discussed, this feels, does it not, infinitely more serious?
This is far more serious. First of all, it's a much bigger and much more strategically important country. Saakashvili brought it on himself to some degree by initiating the attack against Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia. And to some degree, part of the bargain after 1990 was allegedly that we shouldn't be putting NATO flags in former parts of the Soviet Union other than the Baltics. So it was more controversial. This is very clear. This is a clear case, as Secretary Kerry said, of aggression and occupation, and it needs to be condemned, and we're going to have to react against it if Putin doesn't stand down quickly.
Well, Alexander Nekrassov, the Russia-Georgia war ended up with the pro-EU Georgian president being ousted and Georgia returning to the Russian sphere of influence. Is there going to be a similar conclusion here, do you think?
Well, in Ukraine it happened the same with the Orange Revolution. All these politicians were thrown out of power, lost the election, and it's actually, I find it quite amusing, this sense of annoyance coming from Western politicians who have badly misjudged what the response would be of Russia when they meddled into Ukrainian affairs and installed a regime breaking, by the way, the next day after the agreement was signed, brokered by the EU on the 21st of February.
Wow,
now they're telling us it's
Russia.
It's Russia that has, you see, is
well,
the
Russian
aggressor.
Troops going
it's remarkable, isn't it? Because we have seen what was happening in Kiev. We have seen direct involvement of Western politicians coming over to Kiev, encouraging those protesters who were armed, by the way, who were using thugs, armed thugs, to shoot at the police. And now we're hearing all these wonderful scenarios of Russia attacking, invading Ukraine.
Well, let me bring in Anne Applebaum. Western meddling.
Let's be really clear about what happened. There was a deal signed. It was brokered by EU foreign ministers. Immediately after the deal was signed, President Yanukovych left his building. He recalled all security troops to leave all government buildings in Kiev, and then he left the country. In other words, he had no intention of ever seeing through the deal. The deal ended immediately as soon as it was signed. What happened next has been almost from a playbook. It was clearly planned. There's been a series of fake separatist demonstrations all over Ukraine, and the Russian army is coming in. So let's be absolutely clear that the West did not provoke what is happening now. It was a Russian decision to intervene, and in fact nobody expected it, and people have been extremely surprised.
So Malcolm Rifkind, Western meddling, so what should the West do now in terms of sanctions?
Well, the contribution of your Russian colleague shows exactly the rather sad and depressing mindset that still exists in Moscow. They think of Ukraine as some sort of semi-independent colony which they have a particular right to interfere in. We are told that because a British or an American or other European politicians go to Kiev, that is meddling of an unacceptable kind. But for Russian troops to invade the territory of another country, that somehow is an acceptable form of behavior. This is why this is not just a Ukrainian crisis, this is a European crisis. You cannot have Russia as the only country in Europe that believes it has a right on its own determination to send its troops over its borders into the territory of another state. No other European country claims that right. No other country has tried to exercise such a right. And this is why this is so dangerous.
Alexander Nekrassov, if you could respond to that, please.
Well, I would like to respond very simply. Pretty rich of politicians talking about Russia invading Ukraine when we have, you know, the terrible examples of Iraq and other countries that have been invaded directly and turned into hellholes, by the way, by the Western countries and NATO. And another thing is that we are hearing about sanctions and punishment that Russia is supposed to be put through. I can tell you something. President Putin is more concerned what his people are thinking rather than who is going to come to the G8. And G8, by the way, is already half dead. And I can tell you, this is the more important thing. And he has got support. And also, the giant in the East, the Russian-speaking population, have woken up to the coup which the West has supported.
Okay.
So they will not tolerate this anymore.
Okay, James Jeffrey, sanctions won't work.
Sanctions are not going to change Putin's worldview or the worldview of much of the Russian people. We're getting a good example of this. What we need to do is to restructure our approach to international relations. We need to push the transatlantic trade and investment treaty with Europe, which will allow the U.S. to export gas, among many other things, to Europe, weaning Europe from its dependency on Russian energy. We need to relook at military options, including beefing up the Baltics and Poland to ensure that Putin understands. I mean, the question is, what would Putin do if he were in charge of NATO right now? You know he'd be moving troops to the border. Not necessarily, we can't do anything militarily in the Ukraine, but we certainly can make it clear that we will protect our interests in the region. And I'd point out 2 NATO countries have 25% Russian populations, so will our friend in Moscow tomorrow think that maybe they're not being treated well, and Putin has a right to march into Estonia and Latvia as well? These are the kind of questions we need to look at urgently.
Okay, and Applebaum, sanctions are pretty useless, aren't they?
No, actually, sanctions can work. They've been extremely successful in reshaping the worldview of the Iranians. What's also extremely important in this case is, you know, this is a regime that is in which the business and the political interests of the elite are intertwined. It's also a regime who, although they rule in one country, they invest, they play, they send their wives and children to live in Western Europe. For a long time, this has been tolerated in Western Europe. You know, we're happy to take their money. It may be now to say, stop, it's time, as my American colleague says, to relook at this relationship, not only in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of how much corrupt Russian money do we want in Western capitals? How much have we been really enabling this regime and allowing it to exist? And this may be the time to re-examine that question, too.
Anne Applebaum, Alexander Nekrassov, and James Jeffrey and Sir Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much for joining me.